On this edition of On the Mark with Mark Carman, we've got one big guest for you, Nick Wright. First things first, Fox Sports 1, What's Right on SiriusXM Radio. Did radio with Nick. He's a fascinating guy, and we're going to have the big conversation with him, the deep dive on Nicky's background today. I think you'll enjoy the conversation. Plus, don't forget my final thoughts at the end. I had a special week in New York City. On the Mark with yours truly, Mark Carman, starts right now. It's On the Mark, and Nick Wright's a good friend of mine. I worked in radio with him in Kansas City. We've been trying to do this interview for 2 years. I had to fly to New York to go to the U.S. Open, but it's happening today. Good to see you, Nicky.
You too, Carm. I'm glad we could finally get this worked into your very busy schedule. Multimedia superstar in Chicago, as you always said you would be, and I'll be honest, as I at various points doubted you actually would be. People should know, when you say good friend of mine, Mark Carman might be my non-high school oldest friend in the world. In fact, he is my oldest friend of people that I didn't go to school with, and a lot of my success comes from having worked with Mark Carman early in my career, looking at the things he's done, things he does, and then trying to do the opposite. So I'm excited to do this.
That's not very nice, but I still appreciate you doing the podcast. Let me tell the story, I guess, first, when I met you. I go to Kansas City. I get this job where I'm going to be the producer for Nick Wright's show. I'm going to do updates, and they're going to perhaps let me host. So I was going down there to try to get on the air. Had no interest in your show. Had nothing to do with who you were. Didn't know who you were. And I walk in, and I see this. What were you, 27 at the time?
I was no. I left Kansas City at 27. Okay, so I would have been. You got there in 2009. So I was 24 at the time.
So here's this 24-year-old kid who's wearing jeans down to his ankles. He's standing there doing radio, standing up, then jumping into the chair, then doing the catcher stance in the chair, then getting out of the chair. And, you know, you're a unique-looking cat. And I'm like, who in the fuck is this guy? Sorry to throw that. I don't swear on the Mark too often, but I was like, that was my reaction. And then about a month later, I'm like, this is the most talented dude that I've seen in the business.
You know what's so funny about that is my reaction to meeting you, it was so different. It was, you come in, you've got the salt and pepper hair, you are dressed great, you are put together, you look a little athletic, and I was like, wow, they really brought me. They said they were going to go out and find the best producer possible, and a month into it, I was like, well, this guy got me Tom Izzo on our first show ever, and since then, I think has booked 17 consecutive beat writers from the secondary papers in their respective cities, and is yet to properly execute one sports update. So we both had initial reactions of the opposing person's viability that were proven to be off the mark, as we are now on the Mark podcast.
It's very, very true, and I think what Ryan McGuire, who hired me, and then we won't get into the part where he fired me, but I think he thought that I was doing all the bookings for the show in Chicago. He didn't realize that David Kaplan, the host, had all the connections, and all I did was, 90% of the time remember to call them. But so, all right, let's go back. You grew up in Kansas City. People probably know that. You're, diehard Chief fan. I guess a diehard Royals fan too.
Correct.
All right, and your parents. Just give a little background here. Your dad's a fireman, and your mom's a lawyer. Is that right?
No. So my dad's a fireman who also, during his journey, got a law degree. He was president of Firefighters Union and longtime fire captain in Kansas City. My mom was just very successful businesswoman, but not a law degree. Some postgraduate degrees, but not a law degree. And so I grew up. A lot of people assumed I was going to be a fireman or be a lawyer or a used car salesman. Those were the things people probably thought of me. But up until about age 9 or 10, I was pretty convinced I was going to be Moses Malone. And then once I realized I was not going to be Moses Malone, I quickly transitioned that I was going to be someone that wanted to talk about Moses Malone. And so I set my sights on Syracuse very early. Is the only school I ever applied to and the only school I was ever going to apply to. And thankfully I got in and started my journey there at WAER.
Were your parents like, Nick, you're going to study tonight, you are not going out? Like, would you call it a high-performing family, or was it more self-motivated? Like, did your mom put you in your room, until you have your homework done, you're not doing anything?
Well, there was an expectation of academic excellence that had to be met in the household. What I will say is that it wasn't you had to get straight A's. It was, now my sister got straight A's and A pluses. She graduated with a 4.2 or 4.3 GPA on a 4.0 scale. I was much more of the approach academically, which it was, school wasn't incredibly difficult for me in this regard. I could get B pluses, A minuses with very, very little work put in, and that was kind of my approach. And so I think if I would have brought home a C, it would have caused drama in the house, but I never did, and so my parents didn't. My dad was a little more hard-nosed than my mom on this stuff, but I brought home low A's, high B's, and I never really got. That was never a problem. I will say, my parents split up or got divorced when going into my freshman year, and my mom also had to travel. At this point, she was essentially running Sprint's international division, so she traveled a lot. And there was a period of time in high school where I was a bad kid, where I had, I'd say, limited supervision. And again, my parents, I couldn't ask for two better parents. And a lot of it was just me being deceptive. But I had a period in high school where it was probably a 9-month period where I had 5 separate police interactions, I'll call it that, and ended up locked up once, briefly, but still locked up and as high school kids often do, got, charged with marijuana possession. And so, like, I kind of lived a little more on the edge in high school than I certainly should have, being a kid of means, with all the opportunity in the world in front of me. But let me put it like this. As a parent of 3 now, I can't imagine being my parent in high school. And whenever I think about my son, who's my oldest of the kids, who's 21, that whenever he would screw up a little bit in high school or get in a little bit of trouble, I would always think, well, how mad can I really get knowing what I know about how I conducted myself and I turned out fine?
Would you say that you were rattled by your parents splitting up? Did you see it coming? I don't know how personal we want to go here, but I'm curious.
Oh yeah, that's, as for most kids, that's a big moment in your life. Now, when I was, I think, 7, my dad moved out, and they were separated for 2 years, I think. Then he moved back in. It was good, I would say, for another year or 2, and then it was really bad up until the divorce. Really bad, it's all relative. There was never any spanking wasn't even allowed in my household. There was no violence, nothing like that. But listen, my parents were the only possible explanation for them ever getting together was for my sister and myself to be able to exist. My mom was, when they got together, my mom had degrees from Vassar, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard. My dad had barely graduated high school at the time. Now, since then, he has a master's from Harvard and a law degree, but at the time, he was a fireman in a union trade program at Harvard, like a 6 or 16-week program. That's when my parents met. And when they got married, the agreement was my mom, with all those degrees, was not going to work, was going to be a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was going to support the family as a fireman. And so my parents... my mom was from, I wouldn't say wealthy, but a well-off New York City family. My dad was from a broken home in very poor part of Kansas City. It never really made sense for them to be together, and I think that they were spectacular parents, but they had very different ideas on everything, on life, on parenting, on everything. And so I would say it was... anyone that grows up with your parents fight a lot, that's a thing, and yeah, I'd say the divorce was a. I don't really think about it that much, but it was obviously a big moment in my childhood, a big moment in my life. Now, my dad moved 2 blocks away, and so my dad lived 2 blocks away for the rest of high school. I lived, I split time obviously, but I stayed in the house that I'd grown up in, so my parents did as good as you can do, but, such is life, I suppose.
I just always had a fondness for when you would talk about going to Chiefs games with your dad, and the fact that just how proud. I mean, I know you're proud incredibly of both your parents, but there was a certain something about with your dad and his journey that I think you really wanted to promote, if that's a word.
Well, so for my dad, yes, because there are parts of it that I could have grown up, I believe, in my mom's household and been successful. I don't think I could have in my dad's. And so there's a part of, his story that I have a lot of respect for what he overcame. And by the way, my mom, as a young adult, her older brother died absolutely tragically, and she kept her parents together for 30 years. I don't mean kept them married, I mean kept them afloat after, because they're losing a child the way she lost her brother, the way they lost their son. So, but I think one of the reasons that I've had I think work ethic and drive are my 2 best professional traits, aside from my newfound gorgeous hair. And I think I got that because I'll just give briefly the story of each of my parents. My mom graduated high school young, as I mentioned, went to Vassar, went to Johns Hopkins, went to Harvard. I think when she ended her time at Sprint, I think she was the highest. It was the highest a woman had ever risen in that company. So she's a super high achiever. My dad, as I mentioned, broken home, barely graduates high school, gets on the fire department, goes to jail twice because. Not for anything he did wrong, but at the time it was illegal for firefighters to strike. And he was part of the union, and they struck. He was part of the union leadership, and they struck. They got thrown in jail. He had to be pardoned by the governor twice. And he went to Harvard for a union trade program, did so brilliantly in it that he was admitted to their master's program I guess when they admitted him, because he had done so well in the trade program, they assumed he had an undergrad, but he didn't. And then while running the firefighters union, and he ended up being president of the firefighters union and being a firefighter and a dad, all these things, he applied to law school, and I assume on his application, when they saw masters from Harvard, they just assumed he had an undergrad, and he got admitted. And then graduates law school, I think at or very near the very top of his class, and then they weren't going to let him take the bar because he didn't have an undergrad, and found a way to. I think he's the only person in the country that can say master's law degree and no undergrad. So that's him. And my older sister, in high school, despite being 5'2" and tearing her ACL in the middle of her junior year, got 13 varsity letters in 12 seasons. And as I mentioned, was a super high achiever academically, and ultimately went on to Columbia Law and now works for, and I believe will be a partner one day, if sooner than later, at one of the most powerful and prominent law firms in the world. So I went to Syracuse, and that was it. And I said, I'm going to talk about sports for a living. With the advantages I had built in with, I would say, a pretty decent raw IQ points, those things working for me. If I'm going to do this for a living, to me the only way I could almost justify it is if I try to see how absolutely far I can take it to the highest level. So that's where I would say that my family life there shaped my professional approach. And the other way my parents shaped me is I got very, very lucky that I had two parents that were deeply and firmly forever committed to racial and societal justice.